is an instructional video on how to make different color palettes and use them. So, first I'm starting in Procreate, the digital art program on the iPad. You go to Insert a Photo and take a photo you'd like to get the colors from. Before doing this step, you need to go online and get photos. You can get photos of art or actual photos of things from real life. This is an example of an important color palette, Jungle and Forest. I went in and selected all the colors. In order to do this, you need to go to the Pallets section and then create a new palette by hitting the plus sign in the upper right corner. Then, you simply select with the eyedropper tool by holding your finger down over the color and tap the blank square in the spot in order to have the color on that palette. You can make many different palettes and use them again and again. Also remember that you don't have to use the palette exactly unless you're doing an art challenge, and you can add more colors to it, such as starting with a gold palette or a skin tone palette and then adding in ambient light, the highlights, the bounce light, and the shadows, or combining two color palettes, like one of the sunset palettes in the forest, and adjusting the colors so that they fit in the same lighting scenario. Having these color palettes ready to go really does help speed up the process and helps with inspiration in art challenges as well. I advise getting several color palettes together. Here I'm getting many sunset palettes, as well as I was getting a forest and jungle palette. These are palettes I meant to get for a while, but didn't quite get until now. Some palettes I recommend getting include gold, from photos of real gold bars. And remember, real gold actually has darkest red and golden colors to it. If it has another color, it's probably not real gold. I have a field color palette for photos of grassy fields and the edge of the woods, underwater for shallow water, as well as a separate one for deep water, galaxy and other space, daytime sky, pale skin tones, medium and dark skin tones, frost, stony and rocks, elven or tiefling or some other race or mythological people or creature you like to use the same color palette for fairly often, blonde hair and other hair colors such as red or brunette, automobile, which includes the different shades of gray and black in the tires, as well as maybe some common car colors. Remember to get the brightest highlights and the darkest darks in there as well. Here I'm working on creating these color palettes so that I have something to work from for later. Like I said, I can add more colors if I'm unhappy with the limit to the color palette. But another reason to have these color palettes is to use them for art challenges, random creation challenges later, to have color palettes ready to go for future paintings, and in order to do quick sketches, paintings, and art challenges. Now, another thing about this is that all the images I used here were public domain. That's because this is a YouTube video, but you don't have to worry about that if you're just creating color palettes and not displaying the creation process, because no one can copyright a color palette or color scheme. As long as you're painting your own original work using that color palette, there's no problem with copyright. Here I'm making a painting of a sunset type sky using some of the colors I got in the color palette. I'm multitasking on my iPad Pro by gently pulling up on the bottom of the screen and pulling the photos into the Procreate area. Then I'm pulling it over to the side and pushing it down in place. There's many tutorials about how to do this. This way, I can look at my photo reference while I'm painting in Procreate, and I can use it to help inspire and help me with my painting process. If you're looking at multiple references small like this, you're less likely to copy something directly as well. There are lots of tips on using reference but not being a slave to it as well. Here I'm working with the color palette I already set up before and various brushes I'd previously downloaded. I used a screen recording so that it would be more clear how I did all these things, a little bit clearer, instead of just the regular time-lapse recording Procreate does. Another tip is to Google search color or color palette specifically. You can find color palettes other people have already made, often with their photo reference inspiration with them. You can just copy these directly into Procreate using the method I showed you. You can also look up the names of artists that you like, or just artists you know are really good, like the old masters. looking for color palettes and colors in photos or artworks that you like, and creating your own color palette from them. You can also create color palettes just by opening up the color wheel, picking random colors or the colors you want. You can use various art tips that you've heard before, like complementary, triadic, or split complementary, to make color palettes that way as well. There's many options for creating color palettes. If you're creating fan art, you should import a photo reference of an official artwork of that character and directly copy the colors from it. You might want to copy from different lighting scenarios if you're planning on doing this character multiple times in different lighting scenarios, such as having one bright day, nighttime, sunset, overcast. There can be different palettes for different times of day. And as I said, these are the base colors, not the finalized versions, and everything has to be adapted to the lighting scenario that things are in. So, for example, I only used colors from my sunset palette for this dragon, and that makes it very much match in with the lighting scenario of the background. But in many lighting situations, you're going to still be using different base colors for the objects or creatures in the lighting scenario. The highlights and shadows, however, will very much be affected by the overall lighting. Shadows will take on ambient light that is reflected from the sky colors in the area, as well as objects nearby. The type of surface that's reflecting the light affects the way the colors look, as well as the color of that surface. Shadows often have a blue cast in bright daylight because the sky is blue. Shadows can often look purple on reddish objects because the blue of the sky is interacting with the red and making more of a purple shadow. Some of these things are very complex, and skin is luminous and partially translucent, and that's why skin tones are even more complicated. Still, having some base tones in a color palette can often come in handy, but you really do have to remember to adjust things to your lighting scenario and situation, rather than depending on the palette to be exactly the same every time. If you're working in a cartoony style, or copying something out that's in an anime or other simplified style, there might only be a few lighting scenarios you have to deal with, and then you can just have the color palette ready to go, no matter how many times you're painting that character. I also recommend highly making color palettes of your own original characters that you're going to be drawing over and over or painting over and over by opening the best artwork you've done so far of that character into something like Procreate, wherever you're doing the art, and color picking a palette of all the main colors in that character for you to reuse. If there's a lot of colors, you can do separate skin, hair, and costume color palettes to be used together once you're working on the finalized artwork. Some designs have more colors or are more complex than others, and that's perfectly fine. Just make sure everything works as a cohesive whole and that you like it, as well as being concerned with making sure that the lighting that everything is lit in is in the same scenario, so everything looks like it's lit by the same light source and it's standing in the same scene. This quick dragon wasn't exactly a masterpiece, but it is a quick example of using different tools available in Procreate and using a color palette I just made to do a quick painting real fast. It didn't actually take me very long, and it's not my proudest work, but I do think it is a good example of how to use one of these sunset color palettes I just made to create a decent artwork. The other thing to remember that I might not have mentioned before is to name your palettes. Especially in Procreate, that's easy. Just select that palette and there'll be a line that says Untitled Palette. Tap that line with your finger or the Apple Pencil until it brings up the keyboard, and then type in a title for the palette. That way everything's named and labeled, and you can look for it by name, not just by sight. It's better for your organization if things have names. Another thing I might not have mentioned is that you can delete colors you've accidentally selected twice or that are too similar to another color in your color palette. Just use your finger to hold down on that color for a little while, and then the option to delete it should come up. If you select delete, that color will be removed from your palette and you can put a different color in its place. If you hold down on a color, you can also move them around to organize the order you want the colors to appear in your palette. You can also hold down the palette itself and switch the order in your palette's bar in Procreate. Now this section here is Clip Studio Paint on my iPad Pro. I'm going to make a palette based on islands using some of these public domain images I got on Pexels. It's more difficult in this program. You need to select the color wheel section and then tap on the wrench. Edit color set comes up. You have to tap Add New Settings, label it a name like I did Island, and then select OK. You have to tap on the blank square, select the color with eyedropper by holding down your finger on the iPad, and then tap on the lower right, the little spot you see me tapping here. It's an arrow with a little symbol representing the different palettes. This can be a lot trickier than Procreate. Make sure, before you select a color, that you have tapped a blank square on the palette. Then eyedropper select a color, and then tap that symbol I showed you in the bottom right, the third over from the right, the arrow and the blank palette symbol. Once you get the hang of it, it's not difficult to remember, but it actually is a bit tricky at first, and it took me a little while and a bit of help finding tutorials to actually figure out how to make palettes in Clip Studio. These palettes will appear under the color wheel, which is a square in Clip Studio, and you can easily import photos and pick from them just like Procreate. In Clip Studio, in order to import a photo, you have to go to the top of the screen and select Import from the drop-down menu under File. Then Import Photo. It has to be from the photo library if you want to use the screen grabs that I've been using here. Then, when it's on a layer, make sure to deselect all the adjustment tools, and as I said, you hold down your finger to eyedropper select. The one advantage to Clip Studio's palettes is that they're very big. You can keep adding more cells to the palette by hitting the plus button in the corner with a teardrop symbol. It'll add more. And if you hold down on the color, a drop-down menu comes out that allows you to delete a color you don't think you really need. It's not that different from Procreate, but it's a little less intuitive and a little more difficult, but it's worth the trouble. I also highly recommend downloading free Clip Studio paint brushes in order to get different types of brushes and in order to get textures and different brushes that work better than the default ones. The default ones are decent, but there really aren't that many, and you really can use downloading them. In Clip Studio, in order to do that, it's a bit tricky and you have to sign up for it, so I recommend you look up how to get free brushes through assets in Clip Studio. I'm just doing a quick island painting using only colors from the island palette I just created and using the first reference photo I had copied colors from. I decided that this was the best idea, and I had a bit of an idea of a slightly mountainous island in my mind, but I mostly based it on this photo. This is just a quick example painting that I did using some downloaded brushes. I used a combination of the regular brushes as well as some smudging brushes, and those are the only tools I really used here. I changed my mind about a couple brushes as I was working along, and I made sure to have the painting be pretty quick and spontaneous. It isn't exactly a masterpiece, and it's not the most hyper-realistic painting I've ever done, but it gets the idea of a nice island down. And it's using real colors from actual island photos, so I know the colors are quite accurate to the subject matter, which can make a big difference in realism and believability. Another thing to remember with these color palettes is you don't have to use them for what their initial purpose or original subject matter is. So I could use an island palette to paint a dragon or a Pokemon I invented, or I could use it to design a costume or a dress for a character. You can use it for all sorts of different things, but because it comes from a certain thing in reality, the feeling of that thing will always be evoked. If you created a color palette from Rembrandt or Frank Frazetta, the feeling of the painting and the artist you got those colors from will sort of remain and translate over, but you could use it for something completely different. Another tip is to take photos and screen grabs of real animals and to create color palettes based on those animals, such as getting a color palette based on a tomato frog and then using that color palette for a dragon or an invented parrot, or anything else you think the color palette suits. Get creating some color palettes of your own for reuse in the future and for creating your own original artworks using the colors of nature and artists that came before, or maybe are even still around now. I hope you find this video very useful, and you look forward to future videos done by me. Suggestions are highly suggested, and consider subscribing. New videos weekly. Have a great day. Goodbye.